It's working.
Okay, for those of you in the room here and on Zoom, I just want to remind you that this session is being recorded. And if you're on Zoom and you choose not to be shown in the profiles, you can go ahead and turn off your video. Otherwise, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our presenter from last week, John Schoen, to introduce today's class and today's speaker.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all this morning. We had almost 2 inches of snow at our house, and we were kind of wondering about it. It seems a little early, doesn't it? Don't have snow tires on, but the roads are fine. So I've known the next presenter for 45 years. And Eric is going to talk about Alaska salmon and how they're responding to a changing environment. Eric grew up in Alaska, Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. He went to Service High School. He was a cross-country skier and runner. Went to college in Dartmouth, where he was also a skier, majored in biology. He received his master's and PhD from the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science. And he's now serving as a research assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center at UAF in Fairbanks. He's past president of the Alaska chapter of the American Fisheries Society, and he's got his wife Jenny and his 2 kids, Maya and Toby, love to explore Alaska, and they keep Eric humble. And Maya told Eric sometime in the last year, "Daddy, you're not a real doctor like Mommy is. You're a fish doctor." So, Eric, it's all yours.
Excuse me a second, Eric. This is Sandy. We didn't get a chance to talk about how you want to do questions. Do you want to do that?
I can just, yeah, thanks, Sandy. I'm happy to say that myself. And let me just make sure my screen sharing is working here.
We see both your main screen and then your side slides, so.
Okay, let me try to fix that. Okay, did you see my main slide big now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, nice to see you all I can see the back of your heads in the room and can see a few people are on Zoom. My name's Eric Schoen. Thanks, Dad, for that nice introduction. And yeah, my kids definitely do keep me humble. So today I'm going to be talking about climate, salmon, and fishing communities in Alaska. And just kind of a little bit of housekeeping. I'm joining you from beautiful Fairbanks, where I'm not seeing a lot of snow right outside my office window here at UAF, but we had about 2 inches of snow at my house last night too. So we're about at the same place as you are as far as the changing weather. This is going to be pretty informal. So I have about, I think, 45 minutes of material to share with you. It's going to be, I tried to gear it towards a general audience. You'll have to excuse me. There might be a few stats and graphs that slipped in from academic talks, but we're not going to dwell on the statistics unless you'd like to ask questions about that. Happy to talk about that too. But yeah, if you have questions as we go, this is something, it's fun to talk about salmon in Alaska because pretty much everybody in Alaska knows a whole lot about salmon. I could probably learn quite a bit from many of you. So feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me during as I'm talking, or if you want to put comments in the chat, that's fine if you're on Zoom. And I'll try and pause as I go to give people a chance to ask, but feel free to interrupt me as we go. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time at the end for discussion. Okay, and like my dad said, I'm research faculty at UAF at the International Arctic Research Center. Okay, so you just heard some of this. I'll put a few pictures to it. So this is how a fish nerd talks about his biography. This is my life history. So my juvenile rearing stage was spent in Alaska, in Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. That's me and my sister Sarah on the beach in Juneau, fishing when we were little kids. I made some wayward migrations out to college, came back to Anchorage, spent a few years teaching at UAA actually, and working for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game doing field work. And that's when I met my wife, Jenny, or my future wife, Jenny. And then we both went to the University of Washington at the same time. And then we returned to Fairbanks to spawn. That's where she grew up. And we've been back here since 2012. And we raised two kids, Maya and Toby, who are now 7 and 11. And we enjoy the interior Alaska rivers and the amazing, unique culture of interior Alaska. And now I'm working at UAF as a research faculty member. I was at the Institute of Arctic Biology for a while, and now I'm at IARC. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about salmon. So probably everyone in the room knows salmon populations have been just off the charts, highs and lows over the last 5 years. We've had so many extremes, it's hard to keep track. Here I'm going to highlight a few of the biggest, maybe most important extremes, but I'm sure many of you can think of other examples and maybe in fisheries that you interact with. So since 2020, we have seen record low returns of Chinook and chum salmon to Western Alaska watersheds. So these are watersheds that drain into Bristol Bay. So we say Western for short, but really that includes much of the interior. You can see the blue Yukon watershed on the map there extends way up into Canada. This is home to one of the longest fish migrations, freshwater fish migrations in the world, the Yukon Kings, that swim thousands of miles up into Canada. And of course, everyone in Alaska knows this. When I present this to audiences, like national audiences or people who aren't from the US, I like to point out all these dots on the map. So these are Alaska communities and Canadian communities. And you'll see there's hundreds of them clustered along our river networks and along our coasts. And of course, there's a reason for that. It's because Alaskans have been connected to fish, and in particular connected to salmon for thousands of years. And in the Yukon Basin, Alaskans have been connected to salmon for at least 12,000 years. So that blows me away when I hear those numbers, and that when the archaeologists, they find new artifacts and they're able to extend those time horizons back, that lines up very well with indigenous knowledge, which holds that people have been connected to salmon since time immemorial in much of Alaska. And just 12,000 years, like, it's hard to fathom that. So the Vikings visited North America 1,000 years ago, and that seems like a long time ago to me. My ancestors were in Northern Europe at that time. I can't even imagine what it's like to have ancestors who had been in this place for 12,000 years, and to be able to go fishing where your grandparents fished and where their grandparents fished, sometimes at the same exact place. So we really have extraordinarily deep connections to salmon in Alaska. So Chinook and chum salmon populations have declined, like I mentioned. It hasn't been all bad, though. We've had extraordinary high abundances of other species. So Bristol Bay sockeye 2 years ago hit their all-time record high abundance. So this is things have been going haywire. Things have been really extreme in recent years. So let's just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So as our climate is changing in Alaska, we're seeing feast, famine, and uncertainty in our salmon fisheries. So Bristol Bay sockeye 2 years ago had record high returns. The records go back to the 1880s. That's when the commercial fishery began in Bristol Bay. We have really good numbers on commercial harvest. And then for many decades, we have good numbers on total return. So all the adult salmon that swam back to the bay, whether they were caught in the fisheries or whether they return to their natal stream to spawn. This was the highest year ever. And all management targets for spawning escapement were met in this year, and that still left enough of a surplus for a harvest of 60 million fish, which is just off the charts bonkers. This is much, much higher than the next closest, like the second highest returns. And this came after a decade of unusually high returns. So it really put the icing on the cake. It made a really extreme high abundance, and people made a ton of money. So you can see a couple happy fishermen here. People who had permits and were able to fish in these years made lots of money. The price was good, and it was hugely economically impactful. But at the same time, we had, in the same exact year, 2022, Chinook salmon, which had been declining for over 20 years in Western Alaska, they reached a new record low in 2022. And chum salmon, which had been doing pretty darn well across those same decades, they collapsed abruptly to record lows. And this 1-2 punch really devastated subsistence fishing communities, which often depend in many parts of the Yukon and Kuskokwim, they depend on kings and chums as their two main fisheries resources. So this image here shows a woman working at a fish processing plant. This is the Quick Pack fish processing plant in the lower Yukon River. This used to be where commercial fishermen in the lower Yukon would sell their catch, and it would get processed and then transported to market. But she's not handling Yukon River salmon here. She's repackaging donated Bristol Bay sockeye. And these were donations facilitated by the state of Alaska, and these were donated charitably to many communities along the Yukon. And this is certainly really helpful to have some food in your freezer, and this is very highly appreciated. But this getting the frozen fillets doesn't come anywhere close to making up for the cultural value, the spiritual value, the value in terms of family connections of actually going out and catching your own fish. So we looked at a few pictures. Let's look at some numbers too. Some people like to see graphs. That's kind of how I think. If you're more of a picture person, don't worry, there won't be too many graphs today. But let's just put this into context. So here we have a plot from a report that I and colleagues wrote last year to kind of sum up these extreme ups and downs. So we have Yukon River salmon returns on the top, Kuskokwim in the middle, and Bristol Bay on the bottom. And we've just highlighted a couple of the most notable populations to highlight in this figure. So kings, Chinook are in yellow, chums are in blue, and sockeye are in red. And during the last couple of years, so in 2021 and 2022, these numbers, the bars are comparing. So 0 is the 30-year average. So if it's above if it's above 0, that's a above average return. If it's below 0, it's below average. And look at the numbers there. You're seeing numbers that are 100% above or below average, up to 200% above average for chums in some years. So these are extreme fluctuations in salmon abundance. In particular, I'll highlight 2020 in Bristol Bay, almost 100% above average, so almost double the average return. Well, the year before, or sorry, that same year in the Yukon, kings came back at 81% below average. So only 20% of the average run came back. And chums, with that same up in the Yukon there, the previous year, 2021, came back 92% below average. So only 8% of the average run returned in 2021. So the kings and the chums in the Yukon and throughout Western Alaska have done a little bit better in the last 2 years, but it's been a slow recovery, and it's certainly nowhere back to normal. So it's not just that we're having fewer fish or more fish than usual. The size of the fish are changing too. So this has been noted in many scientific studies. There have been articles in the ADN A lot of people, if you have been fishing for years or decades, you probably noticed this yourself. So recent study by some of my colleagues led by Krista Oak, was a postdoc at the time at UAF. They did a really nice job pulling together data from all over the state, and they found that 4 species of salmon had declined in size, and they found that climate change and competition from hatchery salmon in the ocean were strongly linked with these declines. And this is really important. This connects back to populations. So smaller salmon have fewer eggs, and their eggs are smaller. So we might expect those small eggs to produce small juveniles that might have lower survival rates. So the top panel here, this is data from the Yukon River from Jan Olberger and colleagues. They found that since the 1970s, Yukon kings are now about 6% shorter in body length. So put a tape on the fish, measure from its eye to the fork of its tail. They're about 6% smaller. That doesn't seem like that much, but that translates into about a 30% loss of total egg mass per female. So the average female that returns to the spawning grounds is putting only about 2/3 as many of egg mass into the gravel as her counterparts did back in the 70s. So you could imagine this might have a really big impact on populations. That impact hadn't been quantified until recently, and I'll highlight that in a couple more slides here. So these salmon declines, they've caused unprecedented subsistence fishery closures. So for the first time in the last two or three of the last 5 years, there were no salmon-directed subsistence fishing opportunities allowed on the entire Yukon River basin. So that had never happened before since time immemorial. And the commissioner of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game recently visited Canada earlier this year and negotiated a 7-year moratorium on any fishing for Yukon River king salmon. This the 7 years, that's because that's the life cycle of a king salmon in the Yukon. So the idea is nobody's going to fish for 7 years, and then hopefully that'll help the populations recover. Whether you think that's good policy or not, this was certainly problematic because this agreement was negotiated without consultation of tribes in Alaska. So the tribes were informed after the fact, after the ink had dried on the agreement, but they were not consulted during the process. So this is certainly, there's room for many varied opinions on policy here, but this is causing just tremendous conflict and really highlighting inequities in how these fisheries decisions are made in Alaska. So of course, these changes affect commercial fisheries too, and Alaska has massive commercial fisheries. So this just came out yesterday from NOAA. There's a new NOAA report about losses in the Alaska seafood industry over the last 2 years. So in part due to those high abundances, the record high number of sockeye caught in Bristol Bay. Also, pink salmon have been doing really well until this year, but in the last couple of years, there were just tremendous numbers of pink salmon, both from wild and hatchery production, being produced in Alaska and in Asia, and Asian chum have been doing really well too. So altogether, and this is so led, I mean, large part by Alaska, large part by Russia, there was a market glut, just so many salmon. It was too many salmon for markets to absorb. So this caused tremendous price collapses. And then in Alaska, it's led to processor closures. So processing plants, either companies going bankrupt, consolidating, certain plants in certain communities are being closed. And NOAA just released this report yesterday that said this contributed to almost a $2 billion loss in the Alaska seafood industry during the last 2 years. So these changes, this is a big deal. And I know I don't need to convince anyone in Alaska this is a big deal, but this just puts a dollar value on it. It's about culture. It's about food security. It's about sovereignty, and it's about economics in Alaska. So these are really big, important changes. So here's a roadmap for what we'll be talking about for the rest of our time. So we've had these massive changes. What the heck is going on? Why? Why what do we understand about what's causing these changes in Alaska salmon populations and body size of Alaska salmon? So I'm going to focus, I'll apologize in advance. The material I'm going to cover mostly involves work by myself and my colleagues, because that's just what I'm most familiar with. I'll highlight work from some other colleagues occasionally throughout the talk, but that's not to pat myself on the back. That's just the material that I have readily available to present. And certainly there's a lot of people doing great work on these questions. And there's a lot that I won't be able to cover. So we'll have kind of three parts to this part of the talk. So first we'll get dirty. We'll talk about field work, getting out, catching fish, doing field work on predators, puking them, seeing what's in their stomachs, catching bugs, getting out in wildfire burn areas to understand kind of in a tangible sense, actually doing field work on the ground, trying to understand how climate change is affecting salmon. Then we're going to get nerdy. So then we're going to do some modeling. We're going to incorporate climate science into population dynamics research. And if your eyes are glazing over, you don't need to pay attention. There won't be too many graphs here, and we'll try and make the big points clear. So you can, my goal is for this to be understandable to everybody. And then after that, we'll talk about getting wordy. So conversations, dialogues among indigenous knowledge holders, agency scientists, and academics like me, trying to bridge cultures and disciplines to better wrap our arms around these changes and better understand them. And then that's the end of the rhyming puns. So you don't have to worry about any more of those. So then we'll wrap up by talking about, so what can we do about it? So what can we do to help salmon and fishing communities adapt? And here we're really focused on climate solutions. So the climate's changing. We have limited control over that in Alaska. That's a global problem. We can all do our part, and we certainly should be doing our part. But what can we do at the local and regional levels to actually help salmon adapt and help fishing communities adapt? And I'll highlight a couple of thoughts here. And then I'm going to try to convince you, this will kind of be my thesis. I'm going to make the case that we can better understand and adapt to these changes through collaborations between communities, tribes, biologists, and climate scientists. So this is too big and too complex of a problem for fish biologists like me to go out and solve it on our own. So even though we like to think we're real smart, some of us have advanced degrees, we've got lots of data, we work hard, but this is much bigger than a problem that just biologists can figure out on our own. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Any questions so far?
Yes, Eric, we got a question here.
All right.
I wondered a few minutes ago in your presentation, you referenced a $1.8 billion loss in the fishing industry. And what does that mean? That means that the processors and the fishermen actually earned that much less revenue, or the value of limited entry permits and boats and cannery properties went down? What does the loss mean? Can you give a little more detail about what that represents?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. That report came out yesterday. I skimmed the highlights of it yesterday afternoon and thought it was relevant to include. Their two highlights were this $1.8 billion loss, and this includes it's not just, from what I understand, it's not just the value of the fish sold at the dock or the ex-vessel value of the fish itself, but that also includes processing companies. So that would include things like processing plants that have like fixed costs. They have employees, they have to heat their buildings, they have to maintain things. So my sense is that this is talking about actual dollar value losses. So they spent more money than they were able to bring in over the last 2 years. I don't have the details on that. The other headline though that I can share is they said there was a 50% decline in profitability of the Alaska seafood industry. So and again, if you have a 50% decline in profitability, then that indicates there are some profits. So I'm not quite sure what the details were on their calculations. That report is online. If you Google, what do they call it? I'll pull this up at the end, and I'll point you to the website so we can all take a look at that and read that in more detail. I expect there's going to be some news articles about this coming out in the next few days. They did a big press release, so maybe somebody from one of our Alaska news organizations will write a good article to get into the details. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Any other questions? I think you're ready to go, Eric.
All right. Okay, so I'm sure everybody in Alaska knows this, but we'll just talk about it real quick. Salmon are anadromous. That means they're born in the gravel. They're born in the stream beds or sometimes in the lake beds. They get spawned there by their moms and their dads. The eggs spend the fall and the winter in the gravel. They turn into alevins, which you see here, which are little juveniles that have a yolk sac on their belly. And then as the yolk sac, as hatchery people say, they're buttoned up, the yolk sac disappears and their belly turns into just like a nice white or silvery opaque color. Then these little fry emerge out of the gravel. Some of them go straight to the ocean. So pink and chum salmon just come out of the gravel and go straight to sea. Other species like kings, this is a picture I took of some kings in the Chena River, which is about an hour drive from where my office here in Fairbanks. Kings in Alaska typically spend 1 year rearing in freshwater. Cohos and sockeyes can spend longer than that, depending on the population and the individual. And then they swim out to the ocean as smolts. And then they spend multiple years in the ocean, depending on the species. This could range from 1 year to more. This picture was taken by a colleague of mine down in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula. I think it's cool because it's showing a coho salmon trying to catch some herring in a kelp forest. And I haven't seen a picture quite this evocative from Alaska, but our fish are doing the same thing. They go out to the ocean, they're eating krill, plankton, herring, sand lance, capelin, squid, pretty much whatever they can find, they're going to eat that in the ocean. And their job out there is to grow as fast as they can, get big, put on weight, and not get eaten themselves. So they've got to stay away from killer whales, humpback whales, sharks, sea lions, birds. There are all kinds of predators out there in the ocean that want to gobble them up. So a very small percent of them return. For kings, it's typically between 1 and 10% of the fish that reach the ocean. The smolts that migrate out to the ocean survive to come back as adults. And then, of course, most of them swim back to the same stream where they were born. Some of them, there's new research from Prince William Sound, pink salmon in Prince William Sound swim to within a couple of meters of where they were born. So you see all these pinks packed into this tiny stream. The ones that are up at the little further up river at the top of the stream, a couple 100 yards up there, there's a good chance they were born in that part of that tiny stream. And the ones that are a little closer to tidewater were born in that part. So it's pretty remarkable how close they can get to where they were spawned. But then, of course, some of them don't go back to where they were spawned, and that's how they're able to colonize new habitats. And as glaciers retreat in Glacier Bay, for example, it just takes a couple of years, and there's some salmon checking out those habitats, and then a boy meets a girl, and then all of a sudden there's salmon in that new stream that didn't exist just a few years ago. So super remarkable life history. And of course, we're really familiar with it as Alaskans. So climate can influence salmon throughout this life history. So this is a graphic my colleague Megan Feddern put together for a paper we published last year. And I'll just go through and I'll use this life cycle diagram to talk about a few of the different ways that climate can influence salmon directly. So one important mechanism is that heavy fall rains and high stream flows, when the eggs are in the gravel, that can cause the gravel to move. We call it stream bed scour. And the embryos are really sensitive. There's a period where if the gravel moves, it kills the eggs. So stream bed scour caused by flooding or heavy fall rains can reduce egg survival. And this is not, a lot of these effects aren't linear. So you might expect stream flow, there's some normal range of variation of fall stream flow. It could be low, medium, or high without the gravel moving at all. But once you get above a certain threshold, all of a sudden the river floods, the gravel gets washed around and it kills the eggs. So we might expect a threshold effect here. Moving on to when the fish are a little bit bigger, they're swimming around in the streams. During this juvenile rearing phase, extreme summer stream temperatures or stream flows might reduce juvenile growth rates, or it might reduce their survival rates. So these fish, they need to be able to find food. They need to be able to avoid predators. They need to be able to not just get swept downriver out of their nice little rearing habitats. So extreme conditions might be unfavorable for them here, either highs or lows. And here, just an example, we might expect for temperature effects, kind of a dome-shaped relationship. And we see this all the time in ecology where, really, really cold is not good. Really, really hot is terrible. But there's kind of this Goldilocks zone in the middle where things are just right. And we see a curve kind of like this one that I drew here by hand, showing up all the time. Whereas temperatures increase, fish, they can grow faster, and they grow faster and faster and faster, but then it's kind of plateauing out, and there's this range where they're kind of at their peak. And then once you get past that optimal temperature, it can drop really fast. So basically when they're growing their best, they're kind of getting close to that danger zone. Like they have to be eating like crazy to keep up with their metabolic demand. And when the temperature gets a couple degrees hotter, they can't eat enough, and they lose weight or they even die. So we might expect some effects like this. When the smolts are swimming out to sea, this is a really vulnerable life stage. So they're really vulnerable to predators. They're vulnerable to environmental conditions. And in the Yukon in particular, there's a really strong relationship between river ice breakup timing and population productivity. And we don't know why this is. It keeps popping up in study after study, but late breakup on the Yukon, the smolts that are swimming out, they're 2 years old at that point. And that when they come back as adults, there's fewer of them than you would have expected based on how many spawners came back in their parental generation. So we have a couple ideas. Either maybe they're hitting the ocean too late and they're missing the really good food opportunities in the spring when the zooplankton's blooming, or maybe they're actually getting like injured or washed ashore by flooding. So in years with late breakup, that's when we tend to see more dynamic, more violent breakups with ice jams and flooding. So it's possible there's something happening in the river that's causing those conditions to be unfavorable. And then out in the ocean, these conditions are super critical to how fast the salmon can grow, when their body decides to mature, and just, that a switch flips inside their body and they turn into pre-spawners and they get ready to go back to reproduce. So water temperature is really important. The amount of sea ice in the Bering Sea for those species that are out in that area, and competition with hatchery origin salmon. These are all potential drivers of populations. And then when they return, they swim back upriver to spawn. High summer water temperatures can cause heat stress and pre-spawn mortality. So that means the fish die before they are able to lay their eggs or spray their milt. So maybe they got counted by the fishery managers, and it was looking good. There were enough fish returning to the spawning grounds, but they didn't actually make it there. They died en route. Okay, so these are all a bunch of potential mechanisms that we have been investigating in a series of studies. And then, okay, this heat stress relationship, I'll show you some actual data on this in a little bit, but we might expect a threshold here too, where conditions, if it's cold or medium or pretty warm, the fish are fine. But once you get above a certain threshold value, all of a sudden it's stressful to them. And then if it gets a little bit hotter, it could actually kill them. Okay, so there's been lots of evidence of marine drivers of salmon population dynamics in Alaska in particular. So there have been many studies going back decades showing that ocean conditions affect the ups and downs of salmon populations. And there's still new evidence emerging on this all the time. Marine conditions are really important. And today I'm going to be highlighting more research on freshwater conditions because that's where some of the more emerging research has been. And it's where my research program is specialized, but I just want to say right up front, ocean conditions matter. They're really important. So these are all direct impacts of climate change on fish, but climate can influence salmon indirectly too, because it's not just salmon in the ocean, not just salmon in the rivers. They interact with food webs. So they have predators. They have prey like capelin here in Bering Sea. They have pathogens like ichthyophonus. That's the white stuff in the meat of the salmon that was caught on the Kuskokwim. That's a pathogen that's more prevalent and it has bigger impacts on salmon in years with warmer river temperatures. So I think it's important. A lot of these food web mediated impacts of climate are less understood. But I think these are probably really important, and this is an important area for future research. And I'll highlight a couple of points on this today. And then it's not just changes through climate impacting animals directly or impacting species, but climate change is changing our landscapes too in Alaska. So as the climate warms, we're having retreating glaciers. This is a graphic that my friend Frank Whitmer, who's actually at UAA, he put together for a paper we published a few years ago. This is showing retreat of Skilak Glacier on the Kenai. So the red line indicates where the glacier was in the 50s. And then by the 70s, it hadn't retreated very far, but the glacier had thinned quite a bit. So that ice was much thinner. And then by 2013, it had retreated quite a ways and formed a new proglacial lake. So we're having massive glacial mass losses throughout Alaska, and this has a big impact on fish. We're having more wildfires, more area burned, and more extreme wildfires every year. So this could have a big impact on fish, and I'll talk about some of our research on this in a minute. And then people change landscapes directly too. So we can go out and mess up landscapes with development, road building that doesn't put in adequate culverts. If we clear cut rivers right down to clear cut watersheds right down to the river without an adequate buffer, that could have a big impact on fish. And we can benefit fish too through targeted restoration activities like this. This is a project on the Tonsina River, or I think it's the Little Tonsina in the Copper River Valley. And this was a big collaborative project that just wrapped up recently, where they replaced a failed culvert with a better one that basically, and I think they put in a bridge too, that opened up quite a bit of salmon habitat that had been blocked for many years. So habitat restoration is an important tool we have to help mitigate effects of climate change. Okay, any questions on any of that before we move on? I know this is all pretty conceptual.
I am just curious, how far out do the salmon go in the ocean when you talk about, I mean, I'm sure it varies, but could you give me a couple examples of, I know fishermen go out, several miles when they're coming in, I think, but do any of them go like hundreds of miles in the ocean, or do they stay shore bound, so to speak, for food and stuff?
Yeah, they can go a really long way. So fish from Asia, so Japanese hatchery origin chum salmon in particular, they come all the way up into the Bering Sea and they overlap with our Alaska fish. Fish from the Columbia River, like Columbia River hatchery fish, swim all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska. I like to go trolling for kings out in Prince William Sound with my family. Those fish that we catch there, based on genetics, there's a few Alaska origin fish in there, but it's really a lot of like Washington, Oregon, BC, California fish that come up into the Gulf to feed. So they move around all over the place. And there's been a lot of work with tagging studies where this is kind of a cool area of international cooperation where American, Canadian, Japanese, and Russian scientists have gone out on research cruises in the ocean. They catch a bunch of salmon and tag them, and the tags have numbers, and then those fish swim back to their natal stream, and then the biologists there see a tag and they write down what it was, and they tell the ocean scientists, and they compile all that information. And now they're doing genetics too. So they, like when there's bycatch in the trawl fishery, or fish get caught on a research cruise, they can use genetics and figure out where they came from. And they can go thousands of miles, and stocks from all over the place overlap, and a lot of salmon from all over the world, well, all of the North Pacific, come to Alaskan ocean waters to get big.
So Eric, this is Sandy. I have a question. What guides fish back to what you call a natal stream?
Yeah.
What signals do they use?
Yeah, great question, Sandy. So I guess short answer is that basically they have to do what they do, they have to have a compass in their head, they have to have a map, and then they have to have really good olfaction, or their nose helps them once they get close. And they also cue off each other. So there's evidence that they use collective movement. So they basically, if a group of salmon's going one way, the salmon around them are going to tend to follow. But there's been some cool studies based on, I won't get into details, but the migration patterns that salmon take when they're swimming back home, based on where they are in the ocean, you can't explain it unless they have both a compass, which is, other animals have like a magnetic sense, like sea turtles have a magnetic sense, and salmon, there's evidence they have that too. And you can actually test that by one of my professors at UW, University of Washington, actually put fish in a tank he had a magnetic field, like a bunch of coils of wire underneath the tank, where he could flip the magnetic field that the salmon experienced, and it caused them to swim in a different direction. So there's evidence they have that, but they also need to know where they are in the ocean relative to where they're going, because in places like British Columbia, where Vancouver Island's really big, and it kind of blocks a lot of the streams from the main ocean, and fish will pick the right way, whether they go around the north end or around the south end. That depends on the population, so where they're going, and it depends on where they're coming from in the ocean. So like in a warm year, maybe they're further north to find favorable temperatures. So they're going to go around the north end of Vancouver Island on the way home. And in a cooler year, maybe they're further south in the ocean, and they're going to go around the south end. So people haven't really come up with another way to explain that, other than they've got to know what latitude they're at in the ocean somehow, and they have to have some sense, not that they're thinking this through, or that they like literally look at a map or anything, but there's somehow evolution has given them the ability to have a sense of where they are and which direction they need to swim. And then once they get back to their natal stream, they can smell it. They can smell chemicals, whether it's minerals or like tannins coming out of like wetland areas, or they can smell the signature of their stream. And then apparently these pink salmon in Prince William Sound, they can smell like what part of the stream they came from as babies and get back to that spot. So yeah, a lot to learn in that arena for sure, but those are some of the things that are known.
I have another question. Salmon are part of the food chain, And as you go down to the, base organisms of the food chain of phytoplankton or whatever tiny microscopic critters are the food for the next guy up the ladder and so on. Is there a good enough base to assess how much of the problem is really, scarcity of food or declining abundance? And broadly, is there enough money being invested by the government of Russia or the United States in understanding all the elements of the phenomenon of these declining apex species, populations, or should we be spending more money to better understand it? And I know you have kind of a vested interest in that question, but I'd still like to hear what you have to say about it. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm a soft money research scientist, so I'm probably not going to say, oh, we're spending too much money on research, but really, these are billion-dollar issues in commercial fisheries. Sport fisheries in Alaska are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and maybe billions a year if you account for plane tickets and hotel stays and rental cars and all that. So these are massively important fisheries, and the cultural value is just inestimable. So certainly, I think there's lots of room to be doing more research. Since the Ukraine war started, losing our collaborations with Russian scientists has been really too bad. I hope that we're able to rekindle those soon, but that's been really valuable. These international cooperations, I think, are key to understanding some of the dynamics in the ocean. And to the first point you asked about how well do we understand the prey base in the ocean, how much food there is, how much food they need. There is very good research that's done on that. NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, leads a lot of that work through research cruises in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game does some of that work. And with the chum salmon collapse in Western Alaska in the last couple of years, there was a paper that came out led by NOAA and ADF&G at the end of last year that basically linked the chum salmon collapse to 2 marine heat waves in the Bering Sea and the Gulf. And basically these chum, they swam into a heat wave in the Bering Sea, and there wasn't enough food, and the food was low quality. Like the plankton they were eating were smaller than usual, and they had less fat content. So the fish went into winter skinny, basically, didn't have much energy reserves, and then they swam down into the Gulf of Alaska, which was experiencing another marine heat wave. And basically when the temperature is warmer, a cold-blooded animal like a fish is going to have higher metabolic costs. So they basically needed to eat a lot more to keep up with their metabolism during those heat waves, and there wasn't enough food. The food wasn't good enough. So I think there's pretty clear evidence that the base of the food chain and these bottom-up processes are really important. I think there's also some good evidence that predation is a big factor too, both in freshwater and in the ocean. So there's cases like in my research in rivers, tributaries of the Yukon, we see in warmer years, the salmon grow faster and they grow bigger in freshwater. And we would think that would give them an advantage in the ocean. A lot of times you go to the ocean bigger, you're gonna have a higher survival rate. But we're actually not seeing that. We're seeing either no effect of temperature, these warmer temperatures in freshwater, or negative effects on the population level. And I'll talk about this in a bit, but it's possible that that's linked to changes in predation rates by species like pike that are more warm adapted, and they can actually swim faster. They have a better chance of catching a juvenile salmon just because they're better at swimming when the temperatures get warmer. And then they also have a bigger appetite because their metabolic rates go up. So yeah, I think that, both the prey base is really important. Predators are probably really important, although less understood, and it's all linked to climate.
One more question, I guess. The
Sure.
pathogens that you talked about,
Mhm.
are those, does it kill the fish? And then if humans are ingesting those pathogens, are there any known effects?
Great questions. I'm just going to back up a slide to the picture of that. So this pathogen is called Ichthyophonus. This was first noticed by subsistence fishers on the Yukon a couple of decades ago. A guy named Stan Zaray, who runs a fish wheel near the community of Rampart, started monitoring it, and he started to raise the red flag and tell biologists. And then it took a while for the scientists to really catch on to this. But now there's a ton of research being done on Ichthyophonus, and basically it's this pathogen that they probably get it in the ocean by eating infected prey like herring that have the infection, and then they swim into fresh water, and the infection gets more serious. There's more of these cysts in their muscle tissue. It affects their heart, and it probably affects their like their exercise physiology, like their capacity to swim upriver on this, just enormous migration. So there's little evidence. It's really hard to find a dead fish in the Yukon. So we have clues that they're probably dying during their migration, because they'll count a bunch of fish on the sonar down at the mouth at Pilot Station, and then they're expecting to see a lot of fish on the sonar up at the Canadian border in Eagle. But the last couple of years, there haven't been nearly as many as there should be based on prior years. So that suggests that they're dying en route, but the Yukon's huge and it's silty, and you're not going to find dead king salmon in the Yukon, or no one has been. But there's a lot of research on the prevalence and the acuity of these Ichthyophonus infections, and that's a really leading hypothesis that there's, the fish are getting sick along the way. Their hearts can't handle the stress of this infection on top of this hard migration, and it's probably linked to temperature. So the infection is more severe in warmer water, and also their metabolic demands are higher. They got to swim upriver, bucking the current, and they're feeling heat stress, and they have higher infections. To answer your question about human health, it's safe for people to eat Ichthyophonus infected fish. It won't infect people, but a lot of people find it distasteful, and a lot of people, they won't eat these fish, and it's not considered good food in subsistence fisheries.
I think you're ready.
All right. Okay, we'll keep moving. So changing landscapes are important. So let's get into a little bit more specifics. Let's talk about some of the actual work we've done. So first of all, we did a study. This was led by Kristen Selmer, who is a technician in our lab. And we published this a couple of years ago, but this was looking at predators and their impacts on juvenile salmon in the Unalakleet and the Yukon River basins. And we didn't set out to look at climate links on predators. We just wanted to document which fish are even eating juvenile salmon, under what conditions are they eating juvenile salmon, and are they eating kings, and are there hot spots or periods of the season that have higher predation risk. So what we did, we collected predatory fish stomach contents with help from sport and subsistence fishers. Renee Ivanoff, who's out in Unalakleet, was instrumental in this work. She worked with a bunch of subsistence fishers in the Unalakleet area to basically, when people were going out gill netting to feed their families, they would save the stomachs and give them to her, and she would ship them to us. And then Andy Bassett, who's a subsistence fisher out of Eagle, collected quite a few stomachs for us too when he was out fishing to feed his dogs. And then we did our own field work too. We collected some stomachs that were donated by fishers. We also, when our UAF crew was sampling fish, we collected stomach contents non-lethally by basically pumping the stomach of the fish. So this is a grayling that Kristen caught on the Chena River. she pumped the stomach, and you can see it was loaded with chum salmon fry. So you pump the stomach with a garden pump sprayer, and then the fish pukes, and you pump it into a sieve, and then back in the lab we analyzed what was in there, and we used genetic barcoding to identify species of fish that we couldn't identify just by how they looked. So some highlighted results: we sampled 4 predator species and 3 in the interior. We found that all 3 of these predators did eat Chinook salmon, so grayling and pike. The Chinook made up a tiny fraction of their prey. So it's the black bars and these stacked bar plots. This is kind of there's a lot going on here, but what I want you to focus on is just these black bars. So we sampled fish in main stem rivers and also in sloughs. And even though we caught a bunch of fish, not pike, but a bunch of everything else in the main stems, we pretty much only found Chinook salmon in their stomachs when we caught the predators in sloughs. So that suggests that sloughs the salmon face higher predation risk in sloughs. And we also found much more predation, like almost all of the predation in this 2-year study happened in 1 year when there was record high stream flows. So based on what's happened in the last couple of years, we've kind of gathered more evidence. What we think happened is, let's go back. Basically, high flows in the river, it blows these juvenile king salmon out of their nice main stem rearing habitats where they're living in log jams and little eddies on the side of the river, and they're drift feeding, they're eating bugs that float by. So when during a flood, they can't handle the velocities in that habitat. So they go into sloughs and off-channel habitats as kind of a refuge. They don't get blown down river, and then they get nailed by predators. So we found evidence suggesting that climate, so stream flow in particular, is affecting predation risk for kings in the Yukon. Couple of our more recent projects have been focused on wildfire effects. So this came about because a colleague of mine, Todd Brinkman, went to several Yukon River subsistence fishing communities, and they interviewed subsistence fishers. They interviewed people connected with tribes in these communities. And 2 of the big research priorities that came out of that was people wanted to know, how are wildfires affecting moose and how are they affecting salmon? And Todd went and he studied moose, and he came to me and he said, hey, I don't know a whole lot about salmon. Would you be interested in tackling that question? So it turned out well, because we had been already engaged in studying drift feeding of juvenile Chinook in the Chena River, which flows right through Fairbanks. And it's the 2nd biggest producer of king salmon in the entire Yukon Basin. So a lot of even Fairbanksans don't know this, but during July, if you're in downtown Fairbanks, there's all those bridges that cross the Chena River downtown. There's king salmon swimming under you, under all the cars, crossing the bridges. In an average year, there's thousands of them. So, the average return is about 6,000 kings. It's been a lot lower in the last couple of years, but this is a major producer of king salmon right in the city of Fairbanks. So it's a great research area for us, because we can get there and get home in the same day. So we can bring students out there, and we can do a lot of work that'd be harder to do in a remote place. So we were studying effects of climatic conditions like stream flow on how well these juvenile kings could feed and how fast they were growing. So that study we were in the first year, it was going great. But then we had a surprise, well, we'll call it a surprise research opportunity. They're basically a wildfire. Lightning hit right in the middle of our study area, and it started this big wildfire, and we couldn't get to the gravel bar where there was our main central sampling site where we were launching our boat, and we were collecting all this data. And they cordoned it off, and they were using it for wildland fire crews. They were camping out there. They had all their trucks there, they're landing helicopters, and we couldn't get in. And we basically said, wow, we're screwed. We have 2 years. We're halfway through the first year, and we can't, we got going on the right path, but now we can't get back to our study site. But then we realized, hey, maybe this is a research opportunity. So at the end of the season, when Todd approached me to, can we study effects of wildfire on salmon? We said, well, yeah, let's go back next summer. We have pre-data. We have data from before the fire, above and below the fire. Let's go back the next year and look above and below the wildfire and see how things have changed and see how it compares. So we got funding from the Fire and Ice program at Alaska NSF EPSCoR. And our goals were to compare water quality, fish food, and salmon body size between the fire influenced and then the upstream unburned sites 1 year later. So we did this both in the main stem, which you see on the top figure there. That's what the main stem Chena River looks like up in kind of the core salmon habitat out Chena Hot Springs Road, if you know where that is. And then we studied a bunch of tributaries like the one shown at the bottom here. This is a burn trib, and you can see this is 1 year later. So the fireweed's coming back, but it really got hammered pretty hard. So this is a lot of fun. This happened during COVID. So it was handy to have a local field site because we couldn't really travel to remote communities at that time. Ben Meyer, who's on the top figure there, he led this work. And we just spent a lot of time on the river, got a bunch of students involved. We worked with the Tanana Chiefs Conference here locally and collected a bunch of data. This is Michelle Quillen. She was an undergrad at the time, and now she's doing her master's. She works for Tanana Chiefs. She was one of the important members of the team. She's holding up a juvenile king salmon there. And that's Will Samuel in the back. He was also an undergrad at the time, and now he has his master's and he works for me here at IARC studying fish and beavers and wildfire. So anyway, we caught a bunch of fish. We weighed and measured them, caught a bunch of bugs. And what did we find? So in the fire influenced reach, there was, like you'd expect, a lot of erosion, the turbidity. So the cloudiness of the water was much, much higher. So you had clear water up above this burn scar, and then you get down into the burn scar and the water gets cloudier, which you expect. The temperature was just a little bit warmer, not a huge effect in the main stem because the main stem's big and there's not that much water pouring in from these little tribs. And we found basically with the bugs, we did pretty rigorous analysis, sampled them every 2 weeks, and we didn't find any consistent differences between the burned and the unburned reaches. So, they both went up and down, but there was no big difference on average. And when we measured the fish, this is kind of the take-home message, basically the fish grew to almost exactly the same size above and below the fire influence. So our conclusion was that at least in this one river, following this one fire, the juvenile king salmon, their feeding and growth rates appeared to be resilient to this wildfire. And that makes sense because these fish, wildfires, that is the dominant disturbance pattern in interior Alaska in the boreal forest region. Wildfires are natural. They've been happening for thousands of years. It makes sense that king salmon would be adapted to be resilient to wildfire. But of course, it's a sample size of one. We just had one site. So as a next step, we've been broadening out to look, and now here we can't do field work in thousands of places at once, but we can use satellites to take measurements in thousands of places at once. So we've been using satellite-based remote sensing to look at larger scale wildfire effects and try and put these field data into context. This work is led by my colleague, Jeff Falke. And what we found is using satellite measurements, we've measured that the following wildfires, and now this is looking across the whole Tanana Valley. So thousands and thousands of little patches of ground that surround tributaries or river reaches, and comparing sites that had burned recently with sites that had not burned recently that were otherwise similar before a fire. Following a fire, the burned land area was quite a bit warmer. So we measured the land surface was about 3 degrees warmer, 3 degrees C on average in the first couple of years following a fire. And this graph here shows 2004, which was the biggest fire year in the interior ever recorded. So this is just for purposes of this graph, we're showing a bunch of comparisons that of burned and unburned sites, that the burned ones burned in 2004. You can see they were the same temperature before that fire year, and then the burn sites were much warmer following the fire year. And the effect, surprisingly, it lasted for 15 plus years. So as far forward as our data went, we were still seeing about a 1 degree effect. Separately, Jeff put out a bunch of temperature loggers into the streams, and he's measured that on average, the stream temperatures in the burned reaches were about almost 2 degrees warmer on average. And then I've done modeling, and based on bioenergetics models, we're predicting that juvenile salmon should be able to grow bigger in these burned areas where the river was warmed up by the wildfire. So what's happening here? The fire, it burns a bunch of the vegetation, and you have less shading. So these sites warm up faster in the spring. They have more solar radiation hitting the ground, and they cool off faster in the fall. But for most of the summer, they're quite a bit warmer. So we're working this up now and getting ready to publish it. I don't want to. This study is taking place in these cool interior tributaries near Fairbanks. So I don't want to give you the impression that wildfire is good for Yukon king salmon overall. And I think actually out near the coast in some of the warmer areas, like the Andrevsky River near St. Mary's, there was a big wildfire out there 2 years ago. And that river is already too hot. It's an area where salmon already experience heat stress. So if you jack up the temperatures a couple degrees in a stream like that, it could have harmful effects. So effects of wildfire, it's certainly not a bad thing across the board. It probably has benefits in the interior. However, in warmer streams, it probably exacerbates the effects of climate change. All right, so we got dirty. We're starting to get nerdy. Any questions on any of that before we move on?
One question?
Yeah, I was
Sure.
just, I have the mic, and then I'll pass it to you for a second question. The question I had was, when you have fires near urban areas, they fight them, and they have all that fire retardant, or flame retardant, whatever it is, that runs off. Is that relatively non-toxic?
That's a really good question. I wonder the same thing. There was a big fire on the Salcha River. I think it was last summer, maybe the summer before. It came right up to the river, and they were fighting it hard because there were cabins in the area. And the Salcha, I said the Chino was the #2 producer of kings in the whole Yukon. Salcha's #1. So it's a super important spawning tributary. And I was concerned if are they dumping fire retardant right on the side of the river? It's going to float into the river, and how's that going to affect salmon? And what I heard from the fire managers is that they in salmon, near salmon streams, they don't use fire retardant. Maybe they would in a worst case scenario, but they try very hard to keep that away from salmon streams. I know some of those fire retardant chemicals like PFAS there's a lot of environmental concerns with those. So I'm not sure if the retardant that they use these days is PFAS free or not, or what effects it has on fish. But I have heard from the fire managers that they do try to avoid depositing that near salmon streams. But I think that ought to be looked into for sure.
On your chart that you just had up before with the comparison starting in 2004, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, obviously the non-fire areas had cooler water, but the long-term trend, at least for that little sample, looks like it's slightly down overall. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. My broader question is all of this research identifying any practical human interventions in what's going on that would, ameliorate the negative impact on populations?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer the second part first because I think that's the most important. Yes, and so I'll talk a little bit about the wildfire study in particular, like what is this, how is this useful information? How is this actionable? So as part of this study, we got from fire managers, we got this kind of list of scenarios of different ways they can fight fires. So they have, depending on where you are in Alaska, either they let it burn, or they might have, maybe there's some cabins in the area or some native allotments or a town. So they might fight it more aggressively. And then there's some areas where there's just absolute aggressive suppression. They will not let a fire burn at all. There was one near my house like that 2 years ago, and they hit it like that afternoon. There were smoke jumpers, and they just absolutely just obliterated that thing before it could take off in the Fairbanks suburbs. So part of what we are looking at is, here we see this effect, we've measured this effect, wildfire, you're going to jack up the land surface temperature for a decade plus, it's going to warm up the stream. It's probably going to, depending on the temperature of the stream to start out with, it could benefit juvenile salmon growth. And then if the stream's warm enough, it could negatively affect adult spawners due to heat stress. But these streams are cold, so that's probably not going to be an issue here. So what we have actually done is we've built these fire management options into our model. So land managers can say, if there's an area that they manage, like Fort Wainwright or the Chena River State Recreation Area, or maybe it's a wildlife refuge, they can select an area of interest like that, or the Fairbanks North Star Borough. And within that area that they care about, they can change fire management options. They can kind of toggle them on and off, and they can see what the effects would be on salmon growth. So that's kind of our kind of an early attempt to make this actionable and put this into practice. So fire managers can say, hey, you know what, we would normally let it burn in this area, but it looks like this stream's warm enough that we could help out the salmon if we actually fight this fire a little more aggressively, or maybe it's vice versa. So that hopefully we're giving them one more piece of information that they can use when they make those decisions.
My intervention question was meant to be much broader than just looking at the effects of fire or different responses to fire. I was talking about across the whole universe of analysis. Has there been anything identified, in terms of the food chain or predation or anything else, where we think we could do something that would, have a measurable positive impact?
Yes, there are a lot of things we can do. I'll touch on several of these at the end when I talk about climate solutions. But one thing I don't have a slide on, but since you asked, with predation, what can we do about that? Well, we've heard from quite a few elders in Alaska Native communities and First Nation communities in Canada that they're concerned that we hear our people used to be out on the land in fish camp, fishing hard all winter long to feed our dog teams. And we used to fish for pike and sheefish and burbot and dollies if you're out near the coast. And now we don't fish. There's fewer people have dog teams. People come back to fish for salmon in the summer, but they're not fishing as hard throughout the year on these freshwater fish that we know eat salmon. So we've heard from many elders that there's concern, and it's also, maybe room for optimism, because these are all important resources that are available. And in some cases, there's more pike, we're hearing, than there used to be in certain areas. So there's interest from tribal groups to better understand, okay, what if we could go revitalize pike fishing in our area? And there's that slough that we know about where, our grandparents used to fish hard every spring, and no one, you don't see many nets out there anymore. But if we can use field work and models and some of our on the ground work and working with indigenous knowledge to understand how those predation impacts have changed over time, due in part to climate change and due in part to human changes in human harvest, then maybe we could say, hey, you know what, if you could go fish in these 3 sloughs at the kind of in the lower stretches of this river that you care about, at this time of year, that's when the predators are just hammering baby king salmon. And it's a 3-week period. And that you know, that might help the salmon if you can go catch some pike at that time at that place. So that's kind of where we're hoping to go with the predation research. And
So,
the,
Eric,
yeah.
I know you thought we'd have all this time, but guess what? We don't. We're out of time, and I'm sorry. I hope you'll come back with more information and some updates at a later point. But I want to thank you, and it's been a really, really interesting session. And anyways, I
Good.
said, hope you'll come back.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Lots of applause. Thanks.
And if anybody, I'm going to pop up my email. If anybody has more questions, shoot me an email. Be happy to chat. There we go. And I'm happy to stay on the Zoom too, if anyone wants to ask a few more questions now. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity. And I really appreciate all the great questions today.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I'll just tell the class that next